The stagecoach lurched violently to one side, throwing Margaret Foster against the wooden interior with enough force to bruise her shoulder, and she knew in that terrible instant that something was desperately wrong. Wind howled outside like a living thing, screaming through cracks in the coach's frame, and the temperature had dropped so dramatically in the past hour that her breath came out in visible clouds, despite the wool blanket wrapped around her trembling form. She pressed her face to the frosted window, trying to see through the white curtain of snow that had transformed the California landscape into an unrecognizable wasteland, and wondered if she would live long enough to meet the man who had sent for her. The advertisement had seemed like Providence when she had discovered it 3 months earlier in a Boston newspaper, tucked between notices for patent medicines and agricultural equipment. Rancher in Quartz Hill, California seeks respectable woman for marriage. Must be of good character and willing to work. Reply to Thomas Irving, care of the Quartz Hill Post Office. Margaret had read those words a dozen times, her fingers tracing the printed letters as though they might reveal some hidden truth about the man who had placed them. She was 22 years old, orphaned, and working 16-hour days in a textile mill that was slowly destroying her lungs with cotton dust. The promise of a new life in the West, even married to a stranger, had seemed infinitely preferable to the gray existence that stretched before her in Massachusetts. Their correspondence had been brief, but reassuring. Thomas Irving wrote in a clear, educated hand about his ranch, about the cattle he raised and the land he had claimed. He was 28, he told her, and had come to California 5 years earlier with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his grandfather. He owned 300 acres now, with a house he had built himself and dreams of expanding his herd. He needed a wife, he explained simply, because a man could not build a future alone. Margaret had appreciated his honesty, the lack of false poetry or empty promises. She had sent him her photograph and her own honest assessment of her situation, and when his reply came with money for passage and a marriage license waiting in Quartz Hill, she had given notice at the mill without hesitation. The journey west had taken 3 weeks, and Margaret had watched the landscape transform outside train windows, had marveled at mountains and prairies she had only read about in books. Everything had gone according to plan until the final leg of her journey. The stagecoach that was supposed to carry her from Sacramento to Quartz Hill had been delayed by 2 days due to reports of unusual weather, but the driver had finally declared it safe enough to attempt the journey. They had made good progress for the first day and a half, stopping at way stations where Margaret had written cheerful letters to Thomas that she planned to hand him upon arrival, describing everything she had seen and felt. Then the storm had descended with shocking speed. The driver had shouted something about pushing through to the next station, his words nearly lost in the rising wind, but that had been hours ago. Now the coach was moving at a crawl, the horses struggling through drifts that seemed to grow deeper with each passing minute. Margaret could hear the driver cursing above, his voice hoarse with cold and fear. She was the only passenger, the other travelers having decided to wait out the weather in Sacramento, and she was beginning to understand that their caution had been wisdom. The coach lurched again, and this time it did not right itself. Margaret felt the sickening sensation of tilting, of gravity shifting, and then she was thrown hard against the ceiling as the vehicle overturned completely. Pain exploded through her ribs, her head struck something solid, and for a moment the world went dark and spinning. When her vision cleared, she found herself lying in a tangle of blankets and scattered belongings, the coach resting on its side. Snow was already blowing in through the door, which now faced skyward like an escape hatch. Miss, are you hurt?" The driver's face appeared above her, red and wind-burned, his eyes wild with panic. "Can you move?" Margaret took inventory of her body, pushing aside the pain to focus on what was important. Her ribs ached terribly, her head throbbed, but she could move her arms and legs. "I think so," she managed, her voice shaking. "What happened?" Wheel broke clean through. "Rotten luck in this weather." He reached down to help her up, his hands rough but gentle. "We are about 10 miles from the next station, but I cannot right the coach alone and the horses are spooked. I need to unhitch them before they hurt themselves." "What should I do?" Margaret asked, already knowing that the answer would be nothing good. The driver's face told her everything. "There is a rocky outcrop about 50 yards that way," he said, pointing in a direction that looked identical to every other direction in the white chaos. "Get yourself there and try to find shelter. I will get the horses secured and come find you, and then we will decide what to do next." Margaret climbed out of the overturned coach, and the wind hit her with the force of a physical blow. It stole her breath, drove snow into her eyes and mouth, and made her stagger. She had never experienced cold like this, had never imagined that weather could be so violently hostile to human life. The driver helped her gather what supplies she could carry: blankets, a canteen, her carpet bag with her few possessions, and then pointed again toward the supposed outcrop. She stumbled in that direction, each step a battle against wind that seemed determined to push her off course. The snow was already above her ankles, and her traveling boots, adequate for city streets, were pitifully inadequate for this. She could not see the outcrop, could not see anything beyond a few feet of white confusion, but she kept moving because stopping meant dying. Her hands were already numb despite her gloves, and her face felt like it was being flayed by invisible knives. When she finally found the rocks, they appeared out of the storm like a miracle, dark stone rising from the white landscape. Margaret pressed against them, searching desperately for anything that might serve as shelter, and found a shallow depression where two large boulders leaned together. It was not much, barely large enough for her to squeeze into, but it blocked the worst of the wind. She pushed her carpetbag in first, then crawled in after it, dragging the blankets behind her. Time became meaningless. Margaret huddled in her inadequate shelter, wrapped in every layer she possessed, and waited for the driver to return. The cold was unlike anything she had experienced, a penetrating, relentless force that seemed to leach the warmth from her bones. She tried to stay alert, tried to listen for sounds of rescue, but the wind was too loud, and eventually her thoughts began to drift in strange directions. She thought of her mother, dead these 5 years, and wondered if she was about to join her. She thought of Thomas Irving, the man she had never met who was expecting her arrival, and felt a strange sense of grief for the life they would never share. The driver did not return. As the hours passed, and the light began to fade though in the storm, it was difficult to tell day from night. Margaret understood with growing certainty that he was not coming back. Either he had been unable to find her in the white confusion, or the storm had claimed him. She was alone, lost in a blizzard in a landscape she did not know, and no one would be searching for her because no one knew she was missing. Except that was not quite true, she realized through the fog of cold and fear. Thomas Irving knew she was supposed to arrive. When the stagecoach failed to appear in Quartz Hill, when the driver failed to report in at the next station, someone would know something had gone wrong. The question was whether anyone would come looking, and whether she could survive long enough for them to find her. Margaret pulled the blankets tighter around herself and tried to conserve her strength. She had food in her bag, hard biscuits and dried meat, and she forced herself to eat a little despite having no appetite. The canteen was already starting to freeze, but she drank sparingly. knowing she needed to make the water last. She had matches, and she considered trying to build a fire, but there was nothing to burn among the rocks, and the wind would likely extinguish any flame she managed to light. Night fell, or perhaps it was simply her imagination that the darkness deepened. Margaret dozed fitfully, waking whenever the cold became too intense, forcing herself to move her hands and feet to maintain circulation. She recited poetry she had memorized as a child, sang hymns in a voice that cracked with cold, did anything to keep her mind active and aware. Sleep, she knew instinctively, would be dangerous. Sleep in this cold might be permanent. The first day passed in a blur of cold and wind. Margaret ate sparingly, drank when her thirst became unbearable, and tried to keep her spirits from sinking into despair. The storm showed no signs of abating, and her shelter, while better than nothing, was far from adequate. Snow drifted into the space between the rocks, and she had to periodically shake it from her blankets. Her feet had lost most feeling, and her fingers were so stiff she could barely move them. She knew these were dangerous signs, knew that frostbite was claiming her extremities, but there was nothing she could do except endure. On what she thought was the second day, though time had become elastic and unreliable, Margaret heard something that was not the wind. It was a distant sound, almost lost in the storm, but distinct enough to make her heart leap with hope. She tried to call out, but her voice was weak and hoarse, barely audible even to her own ears. She struggled to extract herself from her cocoon of blankets, needing several minutes to work frozen fingers enough to push the fabric aside. When she finally emerged from the rocks, the storm seemed to have lessened slightly. The wind still howled, and snow still fell heavily, but visibility had improved from a few feet to perhaps 20 yards. Margaret stood on shaking legs, clutching a boulder for support, and tried to locate the source of the sound she had heard. There. Movement in the white landscape, a dark shape that resolved itself into a horse and rider. Margaret's heart soared, and she tried again to call out, putting every ounce of strength she possessed into her voice. "Here, I am here." The rider's head turned in her direction, and even at this distance she could see his posture change, could sense his sudden alertness. He turned his horse and began moving toward her, and as he drew closer, Margaret could make out more details. He was a tall man, bundled in a heavy coat and wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the snow. A scarf covered most of his face, but she could see his eyes, dark and intense, fixed on her with an expression she could not read. He reached her in less than a minute, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Are you Margaret Foster?" His voice was rough, whether from the cold or emotion she could not tell. "Yes," she managed, and then her legs gave out completely. The man caught her before she hit the ground, his arms strong and sure, and Margaret found herself pressed against a chest that seemed impossibly warm. She wanted to explain, to tell him about the accident and the driver and her attempts to survive, but the words would not come. The relief of being found, of knowing she might actually live, overwhelmed her remaining strength. "I have you," the man said, his voice gentler now. "You are safe. I am Thomas Irving, and I have been searching for you since yesterday morning when your coach did not arrive. Can you ride?" Margaret tried to assess whether she could sit a horse, but her body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy and unresponsive. "I do not know," she admitted. "I cannot feel my feet." Thomas, because it had to be Thomas, her intended husband, the man who had paid for her passage and promised her a new life, made a decision quickly. "I am going to put you on my horse, and I am going to ride behind you and hold you steady. My ranch is about 3 miles from here." "Can you hold on for that long?" "I can try," Margaret said, because what else could she say? She had survived this long. She could survive a little longer. Thomas lifted her onto his horse with surprising ease, considering her dead weight and the layers of blankets still wrapped around her. He mounted behind her, one arm securing her against him while his other hand took the reins. The warmth of his body at her back was startling, almost painful after so many hours of cold, and Margaret leaned into it instinctively. "How did you find me?" she asked as they began moving through the snow, her voice barely above a whisper. "The stagecoach was supposed to arrive 2 mornings ago," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the wind. "When it did not come, and when the storm kept getting worse, I knew something had gone wrong. I found the overturned coach about 5 miles back and the driver's body nearby." Margaret felt a stab of grief for the man who had tried to help her, whose name she had never learned. "He told me to find shelter while he tended the horses. You did the right thing. If you had stayed with the coach, you would have frozen." Thomas's arm tightened slightly around her. "I have been searching in a grid pattern since yesterday morning. I went back to town last night to get fresh supplies and a better horse, then started again at first light. I was about to extend the search radius when I heard you call out." "I thought I was going to die," Margaret said simply, because it was the truth and she was too cold and tired for anything but honesty. "But you did not," Thomas replied. "You survived, and that tells me something important about you, Margaret Foster. You are stronger than you look." The ride to the ranch seemed both endless and impossibly quick. Margaret drifted in and out of awareness, conscious primarily of the warmth at her back and the steady rhythm of the horse's movement. The storm was definitely lessening now, the snow falling more gently, the wind dropping to a more reasonable volume. She caught glimpses of landscape through the white curtain, hills and scattered trees, and then the dark shape of buildings emerging from the storm. Thomas's ranch was larger than Margaret had expected, a solid 2-story house flanked by a barn and several outbuildings. He rode straight to the house, dismounting and then lifting her down with the same easy strength he had shown before. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing an older woman with silver hair and worried eyes. "You found her. Thank God, Thomas. I have been praying constantly." The woman stepped aside to let them enter, and Margaret felt the blast of warmth from inside like a physical embrace. "Bring her to the kitchen where it is warmest. I have water heating." The next hour passed in a blur of sensations. Thomas carried her to a chair near a large stove that radiated blessed heat, and the woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, Thomas's housekeeper, began the careful process of thawing frozen extremities. Margaret learned that warming too quickly could cause damage, that frostbite required gentle treatment, and she bit her lip against the pain as feeling gradually returned to her fingers and toes. Mrs. Chen removed her boots with gentle efficiency, clicking her tongue at the inadequate footwear, and wrapped Margaret's feet in warm towels that were replaced every few minutes. Thomas disappeared briefly and returned with dry clothes, a simple wool dress that must have belonged to someone else because it certainly was not new. He left Margaret in Mrs. Chen's capable hands, and the older woman helped her out of her frozen traveling clothes and into the warm, dry garments. A cup of hot tea appeared, heavily sweetened and laced with something that burned going down but spread warmth through Margaret's chest. When Margaret was finally warm and dry and could form coherent thoughts again, she found herself sitting at a large kitchen table with a bowl of stew in front of her. Thomas sat across from her, watching her with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable under other circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and Margaret found herself studying him in return. He was handsome in a weathered way, his face tanned and lined from years of outdoor work. His dark hair was overlong, curling slightly at his collar, and his eyes were a deep brown that seemed to see more than they should. He had strong hands, scarred and calloused, and when he spoke, his voice carried the confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "I apologize that our first meeting was under such circumstances," Thomas said finally, a slight smile playing at his lips. "I had imagined greeting you at the station, perhaps with flowers." Margaret felt an unexpected laugh bubble up, though it came out more like a sob. "I had imagined arriving clean and presentable, not half frozen and nearly dead. You are alive. That is what matters." Thomas's expression turned serious. "I need to ask you something, Margaret, and I want an honest answer. After everything you have been through, after nearly dying before you even reached Quartz Hill, do you still want to be here? Because I would not blame you if you wanted to turn around and go back to Boston as soon as the weather clears. This land can be harsh, and this storm is proof of that." Margaret considered the question carefully, because it deserved a careful answer. She thought about Boston, about the mill and the life she had left behind, about the reasons she had answered Thomas's advertisement in the first place. And she thought about the past 3 days, about her determination to survive, about the fact that this man had searched for her through a blizzard because he felt responsible for her safety. "I did not come all this way to give up at the first difficulty," she said finally. "Though I would appreciate some warmer boots before we attempt marriage." Thomas's smile was genuine this time, transforming his serious face into something younger and more carefree. "I think that can be arranged. And perhaps we should wait a few days before we visit the minister, give you time to recover and decide if you actually like me." "That seems sensible," Margaret agreed, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders. She had been uncertain what kind of man Thomas Irving would prove to be, whether he would be kind or cruel, patient or demanding. This willingness to let her recover, to give her time and choice, spoke well of his character. Mrs. Chen appeared with more tea and a plate of cookies, clearly pleased to have another woman in the house. "You finish eating and then I will show you to your room. Thomas had it prepared for you, fresh linens and everything." Margaret learned over the next several days that Thomas Irving was a man of considerable depth and surprising contradictions. He ran his ranch with efficiency and clear planning, but he also had a library of books that would not have been out of place in a Boston parlor. He could rope a steer and mend a fence, but he also played piano in the evenings, filling the house with music that made Margaret's heart ache with unexpected beauty. He was quiet by nature, but when he spoke, it was always with purpose and often with dry humor that caught her by surprise. The storm finally blew itself out on the 4th day after Margaret's arrival, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. The temperature rose slightly, and the sun emerged to turn everything into a glittering wonderland. Margaret, her feet wrapped in bandages but healing thanks to Mrs. Chen's attentive care, stood on the front porch and looked out at Thomas's land for the first time in daylight. It was beautiful in a stark, dramatic way that was nothing like the gentle rolling hills of New England. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks white against a brilliant blue sky. The ranch itself sprawled across a valley, the house and outbuildings surrounded by corrals and pastures where cattle grazed. Everything looked clean and new under its blanket of snow, full of promise and possibility. Thomas joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without speaking, and they stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the morning light paint colors across the snow. "I need to check on the herd today," Thomas said eventually. "Some of them drifted during the storm, and I need to make sure none are in trouble. Would you like to come with me? Mrs. Chen can fit you with proper boots, and the fresh air might do you good." Margaret considered the offer. Her body was still recovering, still protesting the abuse she had subjected it to during the storm, but the idea of staying inside for another day held no appeal. "I would like that," she said, "though I should warn you that my experience with horses is limited to watching them pull carriages." "Then it is time you learned properly," Thomas said with a smile. "A ranch wife needs to know how to ride." The casual way he said ranch wife, as though her acceptance of that role was a foregone conclusion, should have bothered Margaret, but somehow it did not. Perhaps it was because she had already made her decision during those terrible hours in the storm. She had chosen this life when she answered his advertisement, had chosen it again when she boarded the train west, and had chosen it a third time when she told him she was not going back to Boston. The question now was not whether she would become Thomas Irving's wife, but what kind of marriage they would build together. Mrs. Chen found Margaret a pair of sturdy boots that had belonged to her daughter, along with a heavy coat and proper gloves. Thomas saddled 2 horses, a large bay gelding for himself and a smaller mare with gentle eyes for Margaret. He spent 20 minutes teaching her the basics of riding, his hands patient and sure as he adjusted her stirrups and showed her how to hold the reins. "Her name is Clover," Thomas explained, stroking the mare's neck. "She is old and steady, and she will take care of you as long as you trust her." They rode out slowly, Thomas keeping his horse close to Margaret's as she found her balance and confidence. The snow made everything more difficult, but Clover picked her way carefully through the drifts, and Margaret found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's movement. The cold air stung her cheeks and made her eyes water, but it felt clean and alive, nothing like the hostile force that had nearly killed her. Thomas led her to a high point overlooking the ranch, and they paused there to let the horses rest. From this vantage point, Margaret could see the full scope of his operation, the cattle scattered across the white pastures, the dark ribbon of a creek cutting through the valley, the smoke rising from the chimney of the distant house. "This is what I wanted to show you," Thomas said quietly. "This is what I am offering you, Margaret. It is not easy, and it will never be easy. There will be storms like the one you survived, and droughts, and probably a dozen other disasters I have not imagined yet. But it is also beautiful, and it is mine, and I want to share it with someone who can appreciate what we might build here." Margaret looked at the land, at the dream made visible, and then she looked at Thomas. His face was open, vulnerable in a way she had not seen before, and she understood that he was as uncertain as she was, as hopeful and as afraid. He had brought her here not to impress her, but to offer her truth, to show her exactly what she would be accepting if she chose to stay. "Tell me about your dreams," Margaret said. "What do you want this place to become?" Thomas's face lit up, and he began to speak with an enthusiasm that was almost boyish. He talked about breeding better cattle, about building up his herd and eventually supplying beef to the mining camps and growing towns throughout California. He talked about improving his land, about irrigation and crop rotation, and all the practical matters of making a ranch profitable. But he also talked about building something lasting, about creating a legacy that would endure beyond his own lifetime. "I want children someday," Thomas admitted, his voice softer now. "Not right away, but eventually. I want them to grow up here, to know this land and love it the way I do. I want them to have opportunities I never had, education and choices. But I also want them to understand the value of hard work, of building something with your own hands." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a warming that had nothing to do with the sun or her borrowed coat. She had not let herself think much about children, about the physical realities of marriage, but hearing Thomas speak about his hopes for the future made it all suddenly real and immediate. "I want those things too," she said carefully. I want a real marriage, Thomas, not just a business arrangement. I want partnership and respect, but I also want affection. Is that something you can offer?" Thomas turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "I would not have sent for you if I wanted only a housekeeper. I want a wife, Margaret, in every sense of the word. I want companionship and conversation. And yes, I want affection and eventually love. I know we are strangers now, but I believe we can build something real together if we are both willing to try." "Then I am willing to try," Margaret said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. She had survived a blizzard, had been lost and found, and now she was choosing her future with open eyes and full knowledge. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, and that evening Thomas asked Margaret if she would like to visit the minister the next day. She agreed, and the following morning they rode into Quartz Hill together, Margaret's heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. Quartz Hill was a small town, barely more than a collection of buildings clustered around a main street, but it had a church and a minister and enough curious residents to make Margaret feel self-conscious as they rode past. She could see people staring, could imagine the gossip that must be flying about the mail-order bride who had nearly died in the storm. But Thomas rode beside her with quiet confidence, his presence a solid reassurance, and Margaret kept her head high. The minister was a kind-faced man named Reverend Matthews who had known Thomas for several years. He asked Margaret the traditional questions about her willingness and understanding, his eyes searching her face for any sign of coercion or doubt. Margaret answered honestly, and she must have been convincing because the minister nodded and agreed to perform the ceremony immediately. There were no flowers, no elaborate dress, no family or friends to witness the moment. Just Margaret and Thomas standing before the minister in a simple church, speaking vows that would bind their lives together. Margaret's voice shook slightly as she promised to love and honor, but Thomas's hand was steady in hers, warm and strong and sure. When the minister pronounced them married and told Thomas he could kiss his bride, there was a moment of hesitation. They had not kissed before, had barely touched beyond the necessary contact during Margaret's rescue, and this first kiss carried the weight of everything that would follow. Thomas leaned down slowly, giving her time to object or pull away, and when his lips met hers it was gentle and questioning, a beginning rather than a claim. Margaret kissed him back, tentative but willing, and felt something flutter to life in her chest. It was not love, not yet, but it was possibility, and that was enough for now. They returned to the ranch as husband and wife, and that evening Thomas moved Margaret's belongings from the guest room to the master bedroom they would now share. Mrs. Chen had prepared a special dinner in honor of the occasion, and the three of them ate together with something approaching celebration. The housekeeper excused herself early, clearly understanding that the newlyweds needed privacy, and Margaret found herself alone with her husband for the first time since speaking their vows. Thomas poured them each a small glass of whiskey, and they sat before the fire in the main room, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I want you to know that there are no expectations for tonight," Thomas said quietly, "or any night for that matter, until you are ready. I meant what I said about wanting a real marriage, but I also understand that we are strangers. I can wait until you are comfortable." Margaret appreciated the consideration, but she also understood the practicalities of their situation. They were married, legally and in the eyes of God, and certain things were expected of a marriage. More than that, she wanted to move forward, wanted to begin building the life they had discussed. Fear and uncertainty would always find reasons to delay, but sometimes courage meant moving forward despite them. "I am as ready as I will ever be," Margaret said, meeting his eyes. "I am nervous, but I trust you, Thomas. Show me what our marriage can be." What followed was tentative and awkward and surprisingly tender. Thomas was patient, taking his time, checking frequently to make sure Margaret was comfortable. There was pain, as she had been told to expect, but there was also intimacy and connection, the strange vulnerability of being so completely open with another person. When it was over, Thomas held her close, his hand stroking her hair, and Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, though she could not have said whether they were from pain or relief or simply overwhelming emotion. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked softly, concern evident in his voice. "I am fine," Margaret assured him, and it was true. She was sore and overwhelmed and uncertain about 1,000 things, but she was also exactly where she was supposed to be. "I am just adjusting to everything changing so quickly." "We have time now," Thomas said. "No more rushing, no more crises. We can build our life together at whatever pace feels right." The weeks that followed took on a comfortable rhythm. Margaret learned the routines of the ranch, the daily tasks that kept the operation running smoothly. She worked alongside Mrs. Chen in the kitchen, learning to cook for ranch hands and make meals stretch when supplies ran low. She tended a garden that was dormant now but would need attention come spring. She learned to ride properly, spending hours with Clover until she could manage the mare with confidence. And she learned about Thomas. She discovered that he woke early, often before dawn, and liked to watch the sunrise with his first cup of coffee. She learned that he read voraciously, anything he could get his hands on, and that he had strong opinions about politics and land management. She discovered that he had a quick temper when frustrated, but rarely directed his anger at people, preferring to take his irritation out on physical labor. She learned that he was generous with his ranch hands, fair in his dealings, and respected by the community. More than that, she learned how he moved through the world, the quiet confidence that came from knowing his own capabilities. She learned the sound of his voice in the darkness, murmuring endearments as they explored the physical aspects of their marriage. She learned the feel of his hands, rough and gentle by turns, and the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. Spring came slowly to Quartz Hill, the snow melting to reveal muddy earth and the first green shoots of new growth. Margaret's garden became a real project, and she spent hours planning what to plant and where, consulting with Mrs. Chen about what grew well in California's climate. Thomas was busy with calving season, often gone from dawn to dusk, helping cows deliver and protecting newborns from predators and weather. It was during this time that Margaret began to understand the true scope of ranch work, the endless cycle of tasks and responsibilities. She pitched in where she could, helping to bottle feed a calf whose mother had died, assisting Mrs. Chen with feeding the ranch hands who came to help with the heavy work of spring. She fell into bed exhausted each night, and Thomas was usually equally tired, but they made time for each other, for quiet conversations in the darkness and slowly growing intimacy. Margaret realized she was falling in love with her husband on a warm April morning when she watched him rescue a calf stuck in mud along the creek bank. He had waded in without hesitation, his focus entirely on the frightened animal, and when he finally pulled the calf free, he had been covered head to toe in mud and grinning like a boy. The combination of competence and joy, of capability and genuine care, struck something deep in Margaret's heart. She walked down to meet him as he carried the calf back to its anxious mother, and when he set the animal down and turned to her with that mud-splattered grin, Margaret reached up and kissed him without thinking. It was different from their previous kisses, carrying heat and certainty, and Thomas responded with gratifying enthusiasm, pulling her close despite his muddy state. "What was that for?" he asked when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard. "For being exactly who you are," Margaret said simply. "For caring about a stuck calf, for working yourself to exhaustion every day, for being patient with me while I learned to be a ranch wife." Thomas's expression turned serious, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. I think I am falling in love with you." "No, that is not right. I think I have already fallen. I look at you and I cannot imagine this life without you in it. You are not just my wife on paper anymore. You are my partner, my companion, and I am grateful every single day that you answered my advertisement." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were happy tears, the kind that came from overwhelming emotion finding release. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly natural. "I did not expect it to happen so quickly, but I do. I love you, Thomas Irving." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally returned to the house they were both grinning foolishly. Mrs. Chen took one look at them and started laughing, shooing Thomas away to clean up while she pulled Margaret into a warm hug. "I am happy for you both," the older woman said simply. "You are good together, and this house needs the sound of laughter." Summer brought its own challenges, long hot days and the constant work of maintaining the ranch. But it also brought joy, evenings spent on the porch watching the stars emerge, trips into town for supplies that became opportunities to explore the surrounding countryside. Margaret met other ranch wives, women who welcomed her into their informal community, and shared advice about everything from preserving food to treating childhood illnesses. It was during one of these conversations that Margaret first realized her monthly courses were late. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely, but when 2 months had passed and her body began to show other telltale signs, she could no longer ignore the possibility. She told Thomas one evening as they prepared for bed, her heart pounding with nervousness and excitement. "I think I might be pregnant," she said, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "I am not certain yet, but all the signs are there." Thomas froze, his shirt half unbuttoned, and for a long moment he simply stared at her. Then his face broke into a smile so wide and genuine that Margaret felt her own anxiety melt away. "Truly, we are going to have a child." "I think so," Margaret confirmed, and then she was swept up in Thomas's arms, held close as he laughed with pure joy. The months that followed were both wonderful and difficult. Margaret's body changed in ways that amazed and sometimes alarmed her, and Mrs. Chen became an invaluable source of information and support. Thomas hovered nervously, constantly worried about Margaret overexerting herself, until she finally had to sit him down and explain that pregnancy was not an illness. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time," Margaret said with exasperated affection. "I am perfectly capable of tending my garden and helping with reasonable tasks. You need to trust me to know my own limitations." Thomas tried to relax, though Margaret could tell it was difficult for him. He built a cradle with his own hands, spending evenings in the barn carefully shaping wood and sanding it smooth. He read every book on childbirth he could find, probably knowing more about the process than Margaret did by the time her confinement approached. Their son was born on a cold November morning, arriving after a long night of labor that left Margaret exhausted but triumphant. Thomas had paced outside the bedroom while Mrs. Chen and the midwife attended to Margaret, and when he was finally allowed in to meet his son, his hands shook as he held the tiny bundle. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, his eyes shining with tears. "Margaret, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Matthew, and he became the center of their world. Margaret had never known she could feel such fierce love for another human being, such overwhelming protectiveness. Thomas was an attentive father, helping with the baby whenever he could, pacing the floor during middle-of-the-night crying sessions, making silly faces to coax smiles from his son. The ranch continued to thrive, and as Matthew grew from baby to toddler to young boy, Margaret and Thomas talked about having more children. A daughter joined them 2 years after Matthew, a tiny girl they named Emily, who had Thomas's dark eyes and Margaret's stubborn determination. And 3 years after that, another son they called James completed their family. Life settled into the beautiful chaos of raising children while running a ranch. The house was filled with noise and laughter, with mud tracked across floors and arguments about chores, with bedtime stories and family dinners around a table that seemed to grow more crowded each year. Margaret taught her children to read and write, drilling them in arithmetic and geography, while Thomas taught them about cattle and land management, about the practical skills they would need to thrive in this place. The years passed, marked by seasonal rhythms and the growth of children. Matthew proved to have his father's affinity for ranching, spending every spare moment following Thomas around and learning the business. Emily was more interested in horses, becoming a fearless rider who could outpace most of the ranch hands by the time she was 12. James, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book, talking about becoming a lawyer or teacher. Margaret and Thomas grew older together, their hair showing threads of silver, their faces gaining new lines. But their love deepened rather than fading, maturing into something solid and enduring. They still found time for each other, quiet moments stolen from the demands of family and ranch, conversations that lasted late into the night, the comfortable intimacy of people who knew each other completely. On their 20th anniversary, Thomas took Margaret back to the spot where he had first shown her the ranch, the high point overlooking the valley. The view had not changed much in 2 decades, though there were more buildings now, more cattle, visible signs of prosperity and growth. Their children were old enough to manage things for an afternoon, giving their parents rare time alone. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked as they sat on the same rock where they had sat so many years before. "Answering my advertisement, coming out here, nearly dying in that blizzard." Margaret considered the question seriously, because Thomas deserved a serious answer. She thought about the frightened young woman who had boarded a train in Boston, about the desperate hours huddled against rocks in a storm, about the uncertainty and fear of beginning a life with a stranger. And then she thought about everything that had come after, the love and laughter and occasionally tears, the family they had built and the life they shared. "Not for a single moment," Margaret said, taking Thomas's hand in hers. "That blizzard brought me to you, and you searched 3 days until you found me. Everything that followed, all the joy and struggle and growth, came from that beginning. How could I regret the best decision I ever made?" Thomas lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the same tender care he had shown her on their wedding day. "I love you, Margaret Irving, today, tomorrow, and every day after that." "And I love you," Margaret replied, watching the sun paint gold across their land, their home, their legacy. Always and forever. 20 more years passed, and the ranch continued to thrive under the management of Thomas and Margaret, with increasing help from their grown children. Matthew had married a kind woman from town named Sarah, and they had built a house on the far edge of the property, raising their own children while managing a significant portion of the herd. Emily, true to her nature, had surprised everyone by opening a horse breeding operation that had gained respect throughout California. James, their dreamer, had indeed become a lawyer, practicing in Sacramento but returning home frequently, unable to completely abandon his roots. Margaret and Thomas had achieved something rare and precious. They had built not just a successful ranch, but a true home filled with generations of love. They had survived droughts and hard winters, economic downturns and personal losses, always together, always supporting each other through whatever challenges arose. On a warm spring morning in their later years, Margaret stood in her garden, her hair now completely silver but her movements still sure and strong. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder, a gesture as familiar as breathing after so many years together. "You remember when you could not tell a tomato plant from a weed?" Thomas teased gently. "And do you remember when you thought women were too delicate for ranch work?" Margaret countered with a laugh. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, hearing the sounds of the ranch operating smoothly around them. This was their legacy, Margaret thought with deep satisfaction. Not just the land or the cattle or the buildings, but the family they had created, the love they had nurtured, the life they had built from the unlikely beginning of a mail-order bride lost in a blizzard and the cowboy who had searched 3 days until he found her. No regrets. Thomas asked softly, echoing the question he had asked so many years before. "Not a single one," Margaret confirmed, turning in his arms to kiss him properly. "You found me in that storm, Thomas, but what we built together is what saved us both. I would go through it all again, every moment, just to end up right here with you." And as they stood together in the garden they had planted, on the land they had nurtured, surrounded by the family they had created, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged. The frightened girl who had answered an advertisement so many years ago had become a woman of strength and purpose, a wife and mother and grandmother, a partner in every sense of the word. The blizzard that had nearly killed her had instead brought her to the greatest love of her life, and for that she would be forever grateful. The sun climbed higher in the California sky, warming the earth and promising another beautiful day on the Irving Ranch. Inside the house, Mrs. Chen was preparing lunch, still spry despite her advanced years, still the heart of their home. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures. The horses ran in their corrals. Children's laughter echoed across the yard. And at the center of it all stood Thomas and Margaret, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary together. This was their happy ending, hard-won and deeply earned, a testament to courage and faith and the transformative power of love. The mail-order bride who had been lost in a blizzard had found her way home, and the cowboy who had searched 3 days to find her had discovered something far more valuable than he had ever imagined possible. Together, they had created a life worth living, a love worth celebrating, and a legacy that would endure for generations to come. As evening approached and the family gathered for dinner, filling the house with warmth and noise and the beautiful chaos of a life well lived, Margaret caught Thomas's eye across the crowded table. He smiled at her, that same smile that had reassured her so many years ago when she was frightened and uncertain, and she smiled back, her heart full to overflowing with gratitude and love. This was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had hoped for when she answered that advertisement so long ago. She had found love in the most unlikely way, had built a family and a home in a land that had once been strange and terrifying. And she had done it all beside a man who had proven himself worthy of her trust, her faith, and her love every single day of their long life together. The years continued to pass gently for Thomas and Margaret Irving, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. Their grandchildren grew, and some began to marry, bringing new energy and ideas to the ranch. The operation expanded further, adapting to new technologies and methods while maintaining the core values that Thomas and Margaret had established from the beginning. Hard work, fair dealing, and genuine care for both the land and the people who worked it. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the family threw a grand celebration, with people coming from all over California to honor the couple who had become something of a legend in the region. The story of how they met, of Margaret nearly dying in the blizzard and Thomas searching desperately to find her, had been told and retold over the years until it had taken on an almost mythical quality. But those who knew them well understood that the real story was not in that dramatic beginning, but in the 50 years of steady devotion that had followed. The celebration was held on the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed an army. Margaret wore a new dress that Emily had insisted on buying for her, a soft blue that matched her eyes, which were still bright and alert despite her years. Thomas, handsome in a suit that he complained about wearing, stood beside her greeting guests, his hand never far from hers. Their children and grandchildren had prepared speeches, each sharing favorite memories and expressing gratitude for the example Thomas and Margaret had set. Matthew talked about watching his father teach him to rope his first calf, and how his mother had bandaged his inevitable injuries while scolding him for being reckless. Emily spoke through tears about her mother's quiet strength, her ability to face any challenge with grace and determination. James, eloquent as always, wove their family story into a broader narrative about the settlement of California, about courage and love and the building of community. When it was finally Thomas's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his joints protesting years of hard work, and looked out at the crowd of family and friends. "I am not much for speeches," he began, his voice still strong despite his age. "But I want to say something about the woman who has stood beside me for 50 years. When I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride all those years ago, I was hoping for a helpmate, someone to share the work and perhaps ease the loneliness. What I got was far more than I deserved or imagined possible." He turned to Margaret, his eyes shining with emotion. "You have been my partner in every sense of the word. You have worked beside me through droughts and storms, celebrated our successes and weathered our failures. You have given me 3 remarkable children and helped me raise them into people we can be proud of. You have made this house a home, filled it with love and laughter, and shown me every day what it means to choose love over convenience, effort over ease." Thomas took Margaret's hand, holding it gently. "When I found you in that blizzard, half frozen and terrified, I had no idea that I was finding the greatest treasure of my life. But I knew it soon enough, and I have been grateful every day since. You are the best decision I ever made, Margaret Foster Irving, and I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, which I did not think was possible." Margaret was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face, and so were many of the guests. She stood and embraced her husband, holding him close while applause and cheers erupted around them. It was a perfect moment, the culmination of a lifetime of love and commitment, witnessed by the family they had built and the community they had helped shape. The celebration continued long into the evening, with music and dancing and storytelling. Margaret danced with Thomas, their movements slow but sure, comfortable with each other in a way that only decades together could create. She danced with her sons and grandsons, watched with joy as Emily whirled past with her own husband, felt the profound satisfaction of seeing the fruits of her labor surrounding her in such abundance. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, the family gathered for one final photograph. 3 generations arranged in front of the house that Thomas had built and Margaret had made into a home. The photographer, using modern equipment that seemed almost magical to Thomas and Margaret, captured them all together, preserving this moment for future generations who would look at the photograph and see the beginning of their own story. That night, as Thomas and Margaret prepared for bed in the room they had shared for 50 years, they moved with the comfortable rhythm of long practice. Thomas helped Margaret with the buttons she could no longer quite manage, and she helped him with the collar that always gave him trouble. They climbed into bed together, Thomas's arm automatically reaching for Margaret to pull her close. "It was a beautiful day," Margaret said softly, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder in the darkness. "It was," Thomas agreed, "though not as beautiful as you." Margaret laughed, the same laugh that had enchanted Thomas 50 years earlier. "You are still a terrible flirt, even after all these years." "Only with you," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Always only with you." They fell silent, both aware of the passage of time, of the years that had brought them to this moment. They were old now, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work and hard living. But their love had not diminished, had not been worn down by time or familiarity. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by shared experience and mutual respect, by the thousand small kindnesses and compromises that made up a long marriage. "You think about that day?" Margaret asked after a while. "The day you found me in the storm?" "Sometimes," Thomas admitted. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really knew you. I think about what my life would have been if I had given up searching, if I had turned back. Empty, I think. Lonely." "I think about it too," Margaret said. "I think about how terrified I was, how certain I was going to die. And then you appeared out of the snow like an answer to a prayer I did not even know I was praying. You saved my life that day, Thomas." "And you saved mine," Thomas replied. "Maybe not from death, but from a half-life of going through motions without meaning. You gave me purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me love, family, a reason to build something that would last." They held each other in the darkness, two old people who had loved each other well and faithfully for half a century, who had built a life together through determination and devotion. And as they drifted toward sleep, both felt the deep contentment that came from a life fully lived, choices made and stood by, love given and received in equal measure. The years that remained to them passed gently, filled with the simple pleasures of watching grandchildren grow and great-grandchildren arrive. The ranch continued to thrive under Matthew's management, with Thomas and Margaret gradually stepping back from daily operations but remaining vital presences, sources of wisdom and stability for the entire family. Thomas passed first, on a quiet spring morning much like the one when he had first shown Margaret the ranch from that high overlook. He died peacefully in his sleep, Margaret beside him, his hand in hers. The loss was profound, a wound that cut deep, but Margaret took comfort in knowing that they had been granted more time together than most couples could hope for, that they had loved each other well until the very end. She lived several more years, remaining sharp and engaged despite her grief, surrounded by the family she and Thomas had created. She told stories about their early days together, about the blizzard and the search and the unlikely beginning of their great love, making sure that future generations would know and understand the foundation upon which their family had been built. When Margaret finally followed Thomas into death, it was with a sense of completion rather than sorrow. She had lived a full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return, had built something meaningful that would continue long after she was gone. Her last conscious thought was of Thomas waiting for her, and she went to meet him with joy in her heart. They were buried side by side on a hillside overlooking the ranch they had built together, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names and dates and a single inscription: "Together forever." And indeed, they were together, in memory and in the legacy they left behind, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their values forward into the future. The Irving Ranch continued to prosper, generation after generation maintaining the traditions that Thomas and Margaret had established while adapting to changing times. The story of the mail-order bride lost in a blizzard, and the cowboy who searched 3 days to find her became family legend, told at gatherings and celebrations, a reminder of the power of determination and the transformative nature of love. And on quiet winter nights, when snow occasionally fell over Quartz Hill, California, family members would look out at the white landscape and think of Margaret huddled against those rocks, of Thomas riding through the storm, of the moment when two strangers became partners, and then lovers and finally legends. They thought about the courage it took to answer an advertisement for a new life, the dedication it required to search for someone you barely knew, and the daily choice to love that turned a practical arrangement into one of the great romances of their family's history. The house that Thomas built still stood, modernized and expanded but fundamentally unchanged, still filled with the echoes of the love that had made it a home. The land was still beautiful, still challenging, still requiring dedication and hard work from those who called it home. And somewhere in the accumulated memories of that place, in the very bones of the ranch itself, the spirits of Thomas and Margaret Irving lived on, testament to the enduring power of love freely given and gratefully received, of two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary together that would last long after they were gone. This was their true legacy, not measured in acres or cattle or material success, but in the love they had shared and the family they had created, in the example they had set for future generations about what marriage could be when two people committed themselves fully to each other, and to the life they were building together. The mail-order bride who had nearly died in a blizzard, and the cowboy who had refused to give up searching for her, had become something far greater than either of them alone could have achieved, had created a love story for the ages, had built a legacy that would endure as long as the Irving family continued to work the California land they had made their own.